The hearing will come to order, and I want to wish everybody a good morning. And thank you for joining us for this important hearing to examine the ongoing human rights situation in Vietnam. The Vietnamese government continues to be an egregious violator of a broad array of human rights. Our distinguished witnesses who are joining us here today, including our former colleague, Ein Cao, and many very distinguished people who have, in many cases themselves, suffered, will provide a detailed account, and I'd like to highlight just a few areas of grave concern. Despite the State Department's decision in 2006 to remove Vietnam from the list of countries of particular concern, or CPC, as designated pursuant to the International Religious Freedom Act, Vietnam, in fact, continues to be among the worst violators of religious freedom in the world. According to the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom 2012 annual report, and I quote, "The government of Vietnam continues to control all religious communities, restrict and penalize independent religious practice severely, and represses individuals and groups viewed as challenging its authority." I agree with the Commission's conclusion that Vietnam should be designated a CPC country. I met courageous religious leaders during my last trip to Vietnam who are struggling for fundamental human rights in their country. Unfortunately, many of them, including Father Lee and the most venerable Thich Quang Do, remain wrongly detained today. There are disturbing reports that Father Lee is suffering poor health. Leaders of religious organizations are not only victimized by the Vietnamese government, individuals in small communities are also targeted by their regime. One of our witnesses today, Mr. Tien Tran, will speak of the brutality that he experienced as a member of the Con Doi parish that was violently repressed in 2010 when they tried to have a funeral procession. I would point out parenthetically that we held hearings, and Congressman Cao will remember it so well because he did so help put those together, at which we talked about the fact that the bullies actually rained upon people during a funeral and beat them and told them that they could not continue with their funeral procession. And unfortunately, people died, people were incarcerated, and torture was rampant. The State Department's upgrade of Vietnam from Tier 2 watch list to Tier 2 with respect to minimum standards for the elimination of human trafficking also needs to be critically examined. The Department's 2012 Trafficking in Persons report states only that Vietnamese women and children are being sexually exploited, but there are severe labor abuses occurring as well, with, not in the absence of, but with the government's complicity. The report acknowledges that state-licensed labor export companies engage in fraud and charge illegal commissions for overseas employment, and that there are documented cases of recruitment companies ignoring pleas for help from workers in exploitative situations. I would note again that Dr. Tong has been instrumental in bringing huge amounts of evidence forward, not only to committees and hearings that I've held and we've held in the past, but also to the Department of State, asking them to use that in bringing their conclusion to a Tier 3 ranking, because it is unmistakable that on this scorecard, Vietnam deserves a Tier 3 ranking as well. As the sponsor of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I am deeply disturbed that the tier rankings are not being better utilized by our State Department to pressure Vietnam to correct the trafficking abuses occurring within its government, not to mention those in the private sector. We will hear from Ms. Hu Wei Zan, who will testify about the ordeal that her sister has endured as a victim of human trafficking. I am deeply disturbed by her story because her sister's situation actually got worse when she asked for help from the Vietnamese embassy. I greatly admire her courage, and the subcommittee is most appreciative of her willingness to speak out and to bring attention to this issue. Despite the dismal status for human rights in Vietnam, we can exert pressure on the Vietnamese government to cease these abuses. I will be introducing the Vietnam Human Rights Act very soon. We're in the final drafting stage of that legislation. And our hope is that swift congressional action on this bill will send a very strong message that Congress will not tolerate continuing human rights abuses in Vietnam. I would note parenthetically that this bill, in a different iteration but very similarly crafted, has passed the House of Representatives with huge margins on 2 occasions, only to die in the United States Senate because holds were put on it to block even a vote by the United States Senate. Finally, during the human rights dialogue with Vietnam in Hanoi, it is imperative that the U.S. government send an unequivocal message to the Vietnamese regime that it must end its human rights abuses against its own citizens. This message, however, should not be confined to the human rights dialogue alone. It must be raised at each opportunity that we have with talks with the Vietnamese government. It should be pervasive every time business, cultural, or any exchange occurs. The ongoing plight of people like Father Lee, the evangelicals, the Montagnard, the Hmong, and the Venerable Thich Quang Do, and all the others who have been repressed needs to be on the table. They need to know that we mean it, that we have not put this in a compartment, hermetically sealed from all other aspects of our bilateral relationship, that human rights matter to this country and matters to the American public. I'd like to now yield to Ms. Bass. Yep. We are joined by our distinguished chairman of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce of California, who has been a champion of human rights in Vietnam, for how much time he may consume.
Thank you. I want to thank Congressman and Subcommittee Chairman Smith for that, and Karen Bass of California, also the ranking member here of this subcommittee. And let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to see Representative Gao with us today, and not only to welcome him back, but to say that his voice is sorely missed on the Hill here as one who spoke consistently for human rights, for religious freedom. And indeed, that brings us to the subject today. The panel that is here has shown a very real dedication, a lot of expertise here in the subject of human rights. But I think it is absolutely dire today that our Department of State, and we in the United States, in the Congress, and in the Senate and the House, managed to express to the government of Vietnam that they're backsliding, they're walking in the wrong direction on religious freedom and freedom of expression, is raising such a serious concern, not only among the international community, but I hear it from Vietnamese Americans. And I saw it firsthand. I have to share with you, in a trip I took to Vietnam, I had an opportunity to talk to some of the religious leaders, including the Venerable Thich Quang Do. But I talked to several who were under house arrest. Now, one of those was subsequently at one of these religious demonstrations and was beaten in such a way as he was permanently injured. And for those of you who follow these human rights cases and follow particularly the case of religious leaders who refuse to bend to the party in Vietnam, and why do they? Well, as explained to me, as shown to me, the Buddhist texts are rewritten by party functionaries so that they are a small fraction of the original text, but the meaning of the text has been changed. And so when the government itself says, well, we have our own new appointed Buddhist leader that we are going to recognize, well, that's because that individual is willing to bend and change the faith. And the question that I have is that when we took Vietnam off of the country of particular concern list, the deal was that the government in Vietnam was going to recognize religious freedom. Now, that means a cessation. That means ending the process of beating religious leaders, who try to speak out for freedom of religion. That means ending the process of seizing church property. That means allowing all faiths to practice. And I'm looking at the 2013 report of the Human Rights Watch, looking down through that. The conclusion is Vietnam suppresses nearly every human right, from freedom of expression, freedom of association, religious freedom. And I think that as we look at the excessive use of force, not just against religious leaders, but also young kids that want to use the internet in order to gain access to information, to see the sentencing for those that are involved in any kind of dialogue about freedom of expression, and see them locked away for these long periods of time, to see the functionaries of the government beating people with electric batons to break up protests over any issue, including environmental issues. And this has remained the same for many years, but frankly, it's getting worse. Vietnam, over the first 6 weeks of this year, the government of Vietnam have convicted in show trials 40 dissidents. Now that means in just less than 2 months, the communist government there has already eclipsed the entire total of last year. That's why these witnesses came here today to speak out. It's because things are regressing in Vietnam. And despite this behavior, Vietnam is actively pursuing a seat at the UN Human Rights Council. The words have no meaning. And in terms of the trafficking issue, which Chris Smith has been involved in for so many years, to hear the individual stories, to hear the complicity of the government of Vietnam doesn't want these stories to surface about what's actually happening to these trafficked victims. And that, indeed, is why, if you complain to the government, you might find yourself in worse shape than if you just suffer through. And the government makes money, in so many cases, off of the abuse of workers. But for the trafficking victims, it is really hell. Their life is a life that no one would ever want to go through. We have got to have the U.S. government stand up for moral principle here. Now, the State Department is heading over to Vietnam for the next round of talks in the U.S.-Vietnam Human Rights Dialogue. And during those talks, I hope that these cases that we discussed today, I hope that our government here in the United States makes it absolutely clear, if Vietnam is serious about pursuing a stronger relation with the United States, well, that's contingent on it starting with one thing for certain, and that is the human rights situation has got to be improved in terms of religious freedom, in terms of these trafficked victims, and in terms of freedom of expression for these young people in Vietnam who want to simply have a dialogue. We can't have these show trials. We can't have this kind of abuse. We can't have these beatings. It must end. It must end now, and I commend the Chairman for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
I want to thank the distinguished Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Royce, for his longstanding and very effective leadership on behalf of the suffering people in Vietnam, and for his very eloquent statement this morning. Ms. Bass, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, as well as Chairman Royce, for your years of work on human rights. And I'm glad today that we're joined by my good colleague from California, Congressman Alan Lowenthal. I want to offer my gratitude today to today's witnesses for your testimony, and I look forward to your insight and perspectives. As we turn to another country and set of human rights issues that greatly require congressional and global attention, it's my hope that this hearing will lead to improved conditions for the Vietnamese people, where freedom of speech, the end of religious persecution, freedom of the press, and a free press are permitted to thrive in a society that is open and truly free. Tomorrow, the U.S. and Vietnam will hold the 17th of its human rights dialogues. Where there might be some advances, and I'm sure today's witnesses will confirm that or not, in the government's crackdown on various freedoms, this is by no means widespread. Organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Vietnam Human Rights Network continue to document the full extent of the government's efforts to undermine the human rights of its citizens at every turn. The upcoming meeting between our two governments presents no better time than the present to raise the seriousness of these concerns and abuses, particularly as the Vietnamese government seeks a seat on the UN Human Rights Council for 2014 to 16. I would like to make very brief remarks on the freedom of speech, human trafficking, and religious persecution. Freedom of expression is fundamental in a society that thrives. Last year, the Vietnamese government arrested activists, bloggers, and human rights lawyers, detaining them for extended periods of time, denied them access to legal counsel, prevented them from contacting their families, and prosecuted them in politically charged trials. Those convicted and sentenced merely sought a society in which their fellow citizens criticize their government to improve society and ensure policies do not exist where people live in fear or are under the threat of censor or arrest. I'm particularly concerned by the trafficking of women, men, and children around the region, and hopefully the witnesses today will give us additional information about that. It's my understanding that both women and men are forced into sexual labor. Women are sold as mail-order brides or surrogate mothers. Men are often sold into indentured servitude, and the most vulnerable citizens, children, are exploited for the purposes of sex, labor, forced begging, or bonded labor. According to the State Department's 2012 Trafficking in Persons report, the Vietnamese government has made some efforts to curb trafficking, but more must be done to combat sexual slavery and the illegal transfer of children to Cambodia, China, and elsewhere. I'm also troubled by the persecution of religious minorities across Vietnam, government seizure of lands, particularly those belonging to religious or other minority groups, the resale of lands belonging to churches and temples, and the infiltration of religious organizations by government agents demonstrate contempt for religious freedom. People should be able to practice their beliefs without fear of punishment or persecution by government officials. I want to conclude by reminding all of us and all our governments the important words that are enshrined within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These words provide us a framework and serve as a guide to ensure that all people are free, live in open and just societies, and their governments, including our own, work with and for people rather than against. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. Everyone has the right to liberty, life, and security of person. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all these forms. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Today, I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Bass. I'd like to yield to Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming to testify. And as we listen to your testimony, one of the things, the clearest message that needs to be taken back, that needs to be heard by the government of Vietnam is that to truly have economic prosperity and economic freedom, there first and must always be the protection of religious liberties, and with human rights to make sure that those are protected and upheld in every situation. We are here in a country that many times, for economic reasons, we look the other way. And that cannot be the case and will not be the case. We would not tolerate this kind of human rights violations among companies here, and to be a good trading partner with the United States, we must stand and be vigilant on this particular issue. And it is non-negotiable. And to highlight this, I appreciate the bravery and the true sense of trying to expose and share in an intimate way the atrocities that are happening, not just in Vietnam, but across many countries, but specifically with what you have had to deal with. I look forward to hearing your testimony, and truly may it be the start of highlighting this over and over again so that real change, not just words, but actions follow up those words. So thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. Chair recognizes Mrs. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Bass, for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing on the human rights conditions in Vietnam. I'd like to also thank the members of the panel for coming to testify today. This hearing is very important to me because of the large numbers of Vietnamese Americans that I proudly represent, particularly in Little Saigon, one of the largest concentrations of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. Since the normalization of diplomatic ties between Vietnam and the United States, Vietnam has gained tremendously from these economic ties and exchanges. In partnering with the United States, Vietnam was admitted into the World Trade Organization, received permanent normal trade status with our country, and it's gained access to the American markets. Currently, the United States is one of Vietnam's largest, if not its largest, exporting partner. But despite these partnerships, the government of Vietnam has yet to demonstrate its commitment to upholding international laws and norms such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Vietnam is a signator. Vietnam has disregarded its promises on respecting human rights and basic freedoms basic freedom of the press, expression, and association of its own citizens, as is already enshrined in the Vietnamese Constitution. Currently, as we speak today, respected religious leaders such as the Supreme Patriarch, Thich Quang Do, of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, and Father Nguyen Vuong Le, along with many activists, are under house arrest. According to reports, as just reported also by, I think, Chairman Royce, at least 50 human rights defenders have been arbitrarily detained within the last year alone, and that rate is increasing exponentially. The persecution of prominent bloggers, such as Ta Phong Tan, who received the State Department's 2013 Woman of Courage Award, journalists such as Phan Ton Hai and Yu Kai, who founded the Free Journalism Club, songwriters such as Viet Cang and Tran Buen Binh, the 14 Catholic youth activists, and most recently, human rights lawyer Le Quoc Quan, all of these persecutions have resulted in the government of Vietnam being strongly criticized and condemned by international rights organizations and by governments around the world. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has ruled that these arrests and detentions are a violation of international law. Mr. Chairman, as the government of Vietnam is seeking Trans-Pacific Partnership agreements along with increasing economic and military exchanges with the United States, my hope is that the United States Congress carefully examines the seriousness and the commitment on the part of the government of Vietnam to respecting human rights and basic freedoms of its citizens, given these current conditions in Vietnam. I recently attended an event in my district where thousands of Vietnamese Americans came together to support the call from religious leaders, from intellectuals, from former Communist Party officials, and from activists in Vietnam demanding constitutional changes and for the Vietnamese government to grant greater freedom to its people. I believe that the United States should use our diplomatic relations to try to influence and do everything that we can to support the people of Vietnam in their aspirations for justice, for liberty, and for freedom. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Mr. Lowenthal, thank you very much for your statement and for your leadership and for being here today and joining us on the panel. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished witnesses, and beginning first, it's expressing the highest honor and privilege to welcome back An Giao, who is a good friend and a tremendous human rights leader. He was born in Vietnam. At the age of 8, he was able to escape the United States with his siblings. After learning English, he did well in school and went on to earn his undergraduate and master's degrees before teaching philosophy and ethics in New Orleans. Congressman Giao went on to earn his law degree and worked for Boat People SOS, and I first met him in the 1990s, to help poor Vietnamese and other minorities. He lost his home and office in Hurricane Katrina, but helped lead his community and as it started to rebuild. In 2008, he became the first Vietnamese American elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and representative of Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District. And as I said at the outset, was a leader on numerous human rights issues, but was the leader on trying to protect the rights of people living in Vietnam. So it is a privilege to have him here. We will then hear from Mr. Vu Van Ai, who serves as the international spokesman for the United Buddhist Church in Vietnam, which is currently banned by the communist dictatorship in Vietnam. He is also the founder and president of KMA, Action for Democracy in Vietnam, and the Vietnam Committee on Human Rights, organizations established in 1976 to raise awareness of the human rights and religious freedom situation in Vietnam, to campaign for the release of prisoners of conscience, and promote democratic freedoms and human rights. He testifies regularly at the United Nations, Human Rights Council, the U.S. Congress, European Parliament, and other international fora on human rights in Vietnam. Welcome. We will then hear from Ms. Anna Buen Ya, who was born in Thailand and came to the United States as a Montagnard refugee in 1986. She graduated from UNC Greensboro in 2006 with a degree in political science and communication studies and received her law degree from Milan University in 2010. She has her own law practice, and outside of her private practice, she does pro bono advocacy on behalf of refugee policy for the Montagnard Human Rights Organization and the Council for Indigenous Peoples in today's Vietnam. We will then hear from Ms. Hu Huy Zan, who is a Vietnamese American who lives in the United States. Her sister is a victim of forced labor scheme in which she went to Russia thinking that she would work in a restaurant, only to find out when she arrived that she would be forced and compelled to work as a prostitute. Her sister was eventually able to return to Vietnam, but there are many others who remain trapped in Russia as well as elsewhere by their Vietnamese traffickers. We welcome her and thank her for her enormous bravery, knowing that there has been retaliations because she has spoken out. We will then hear from Tien Tran, who is a member of the Con Dao village in central Vietnam, where he was a farmer and a member of the local Catholic Church. He was captured by Vietnamese security forces during a funeral at Con Dao on May 4th, 2010. He was jailed and tortured for 7 days in a police detention center. He was able to escape Vietnam and go to Thailand in August of 2010, and then came to the U.S. in September of 2012. We welcome him and express, obviously, our deep sadness as to how he was mistreated, but again, thank him for speaking out for all those who remain and who have been so victimized. We will then hear from Mr. John Sifton, who is the Advocacy Director for Asia for Human Rights Watch, where focuses on South and Southeast Asia. He has extensive experience doing international human rights work with a focus on Asia, but has also worked on issues relating to human trafficking, terrorism, and refugees. Mr. Sifton has traveled to Vietnam, where he investigated the human rights situation and other developments in the country. He works with a wide range of government officials from many countries to provide policy advice and raise awareness of Vietnam's human rights record. And welcome, Mr. Sifton, as well. I would just note we also have Dr. Tang here today. And just one note concerning him, in the 1990s, when I became chairman of the Human Rights Committee, it was Dr. Tang who came to my office and said, this is some information regarding the human rights situation, and especially with regards to the refugees who were in a number of camps, including High Island in Hong Kong and elsewhere, who were about to be forcibly repatriated back to Vietnam, where they were facing a predictably cruel fate and would have been, many of them, put into prison. We organized, as a direct result of Dr. Tang's advocacy, and I will remember this as well, a series of 4 hearings, including one closed hearing. The Clinton administration were intent on sending back those men and women who had been screened out as refugees improperly, even though human rights organizations have made it very clear that they were refugees, that they had a well-founded fear of persecution should they be forcibly or in any way returned back to Vietnam. After the 4 hearings, I offered an amendment, again with the guidance of Dr. Tong, that said no U.S. money will be used to forcibly repatriate anyone. It caused a change in the attitude on the part of the administration. We had some friends within the administration, as Dr. Tong will remember, and as a direct result, the Rover program was established, and frankly, I want to thank Dr. Tong because he is the man, the person, the human rights advocate, and his organization, SOS, Boat People, but he personally, who made the difference in ensuring that upwards of 20,000 people who would have gone back against their will were rescued. And he has been absolutely tenacious in promoting the cause of human rights for all faiths, all believers, all those who are suffering any kind of persecution in Vietnam, including those who have been trafficked. So, Dr. Tong, thank you for your unbelievably effective leadership on behalf of the Vietnamese people. I'm Joseph Cao.
Chairman Smith, I would like to personally thank you and to thank Chairman Royce for you continuing to be the champion of human rights and religious freedom in Vietnam. I would like to also thank Ranking Member Bass and members of the subcommittee for your interest in the human rights and religious freedom conditions in Vietnam and for your willingness to support the fight of the Vietnamese people. Mr. Chairman, basic universal human rights have served as the basis and foundation of modern societies over 6 decades. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights succinctly and rightly states, all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of persons. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. All are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. Pope John Paul II called this declaration one of the highest expressions of the human conscience of our time. Marcelo Spadafora, on behalf of the European Union, stated, the Declaration placed human rights at the center of the framework of principles and obligations shaping relations between the international community. Yet, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam has for decades defiantly trampled these important principles under its feet, proclaiming to the world arrogantly that it is above what are right and decent. Since 2007, Vietnam has been backsliding on human rights and is now the proud possessor of the title, the worst violator of human rights in Southeast Asia. Political opposition is outlawed. Repression of dissidents intensified. Severe restrictions on freedom of expressions are imposed. Bloggers and peaceful activists are arrested, imprisoned, and tortured. In most cases, national security has been cited as a pretext for the illegal arrests and criminal investigations. One of the main groups of people who have suffered greatly under Vietnam's oppression has been the religious faithful and leaders. Vietnam does not hide its strict adherence to the communist assertion that religion is the opium of the people, and they therefore will take any measure, no matter how despicable, to suppress this basic freedom. To defend itself, Vietnam points to its constitution that explicitly recognizes religious freedom. But like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Vietnam's government officials and cronies trampled on the country's constitution, replacing it with a policy of intimidation, repression, and torture. The case of Con Yo Parish succinctly displays Vietnam's contempt for the rule of law. In May of 2010, the Da Nang City's People Committee ordered all households of the all-Catholic Con Yo Parish to sell their residential housing to a private developer, the Sun Group, for a price that was much lower than market price. as the parishioners rejected the deal both because of the low price and because they wanted to preserve their 135-year-old way of life, the government used force, causing multiple injuries and several deaths. Scores of parishioners were arrested, detained, and tortured. The case of Con Yo clearly illustrates Vietnam's intention of wiping out a religious community through the expropriation of farmland, cemetery plots, and residential homes of all parishioners. On May 4, 2010, the authorities even prohibited the burial of a 93-year-old parishioner in the parish cemetery. As parishioners proceeded with the funeral, the police attacked them brutally, causing injuries to over 100 parishioners, including the elderly and children. The police arrested 62 parishioners and tortured them for days during detention. The communist militia caught one parishioner who attempted to escape and tortured him to death. 7 of the parishioners identified by the government as taking the lead in the opposition to the blanket expropriation of the entire Con Yo parish were tried and sentenced to prison terms. Other cases of recent arrest and torture are compiled under Exhibit A, which I would like to submit with this testimony for the subcommittee's review and consideration. I would like also to submit the statement of Reverend Nguyễn Văn Khai under Exhibit B, which succinctly explains Vietnam's position on religious freedom. When I was growing up in Vietnam, the children playfully called the communist regime the Red Devil. After seeing the actions and the atrocities committed by the Vietnamese government against religion, I realized how truthful this statement was. The drafters of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights sufficiently appreciate the danger within a society when the basic freedoms of individuals are not recognized and defended. In the preamble, the drafters stated, "Disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. This disregard and contempt for human rights have led to the Holocaust under the Nazi regime, the Cultural Revolution under Stalin and Mao, and the killing fields under Pol Pot, when countless millions were tortured and killed for their beliefs." Recently in Vietnam, the Catholic bishops and leaders of other religious faiths demanded changes to Vietnam's constitution. These changes include power and land must belong to the people. The U.S. Congress must stand in solidarity with these religious leaders. I ask that this Congress will introduce and pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act of Chairman Smith and the Vietnam Sanctions Act of Chairman Ed Royce. We are America, and we understand that these rights and freedoms are of the greatest importance for human flourishing in the modern world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Congressman Gao. Mr. Ai.
Honorable Chairman, distinguished member of Congress, I will make short remark and submit the full text of my testimony for the record.
Without objection, your full statement and those of all of our distinguished witnesses and any materials you want added to the record will be made part of the record.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, UBCV, the largest and oldest religious community in Vietnam. I appreciated the chance to speak before the dialogue, for I am concerned that the State Department does not realize the gravity of Vietnam's repression of the UBCV. Buddhist leader Thích Quảng Độ expressed the same concern to Ambassador David Shear, who visited him in Saigon. He said, the State Department report of abuses portray but a pale picture of the systematic police pressure, harassment, and intimidation faced by Buddhists in every aspect of daily life. I realize that Vietnam's respective religious policy with their mixture of a certain and sheer brutality are not easy to understand. But I appeal to Congress and the State Department to look behind Hanoi's mask, to see the reality of religious repression against Buddhists and other religious community, and to raise this loud and clear in the coming dialogue in Hanoi. For the past 3 decades, the Communist authorities have systematically targeted the UBCV, detaining and harassing Buddhist monks and nuns. Religious gatherings and festivals, such as the Buddha birthday, are routinely disbanded by police. Foreign visitors are assaulted, followers are threatened with losing their jobs or having their children expelled from school if they worship in UBCV pagoda. The aim is to create a climate of fear in which no one dare leave their faith. Just last week, security agents threw rotten fish and excrement into the home of Buddhist blogger Huỳnh Ngọc Tuấn. He has spent 10 years in prison for his article calling for human rights. In March, Buddhist youth leader Lê Công Cầu was interrogated by security police in Hue for 3 days and threatened with a 20-year prison sentence simply for demanding the legalization of the UBCV. Lê Công Cầu is the head of the Buddhist youth movement, an unofficial educational movement which has over 500,000 members in Vietnam. During the interrogation, police told him that Vietnam would never accept to legalize the UBCV. Monks, nuns, and followers of over 20 provincial boards are prevented from carrying out charitable activity. In August, Venerable Thích Thanh Quang in Da Nang was brutally beaten under the eye of the police, who made no attempt to intervene. The most tragic victim is the UBCV leader and Nobel Peace Prize nominee Thích Quang Do. Despite over 30 years in detention, he refused to be silent. During the recent debate on reforming the Constitution, Thích Quang Do urged the Communist Party to embark on, I quote, a path of peace and multi-party democracy to lead our people to stability, development, and happiness. Alongside political violence, Vietnam also uses the law to curb religious freedom. In January, Decree 92 came into effect, which submits religion to tighter control. Ordinance 44 authorized the detention of religious dissidents under house arrest, in labor camp or psychiatric hospital without any due process of law. Mr. Chairman, the human rights dialogue is only relevant if it leads to concrete progress. The United States should set benchmark and the time frame for improvement and ensure that Vietnam does not use the human rights dialogue as a shield to deflect international scrutiny from its grave abuses of religious freedom and human rights. At the coming dialogue, I urge the U.S. to press Vietnam to release all religious prisoners, particularly UBCV Patriarch Thích Quang Do, and re-establish the unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam legal status. Bring religious legislation into line with Article 18 of the UN Bill of Rights. Fix a date of the visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, to which Vietnam has agreed. Finally, regarding U.S. policy, I urge the U.S. to redesignate Vietnam as a country of particular concern, to mandate the ambassador at large on international religious freedom to visit Vietnam and meet with the wide range of stakeholders, including religious dissidents, and to consult widely with civil society before her trip. To adopt the Vietnam Human Rights Act in order to link trade relations to the respect of religious freedom and human rights. In view of its abysmal human rights record, the U.S. should not support Vietnam's membership of the UN Human Rights Council, which will be voted at the General Assembly in New York in September this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rai, thank you very much for your testimony and your very concrete recommendations to the committee and to the President and to the U.S. Congress at large. I'd like to now ask Ms. Anna Bunya if she would proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Smith and other distinguished members and guests, for the honor and the opportunity to be here to speak with everyone today. Again, my name is Anna Kasora Bunya, and I'm here on behalf of the Montagnard Human Rights Organization, and we are based from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm also here to represent the Montagnard indigenous peoples of the Central Highlands of Vietnam. As some of you may know, the Montagnards were strong and loyal allies with the U.S. government during the Vietnam War, and because of that, after the fall of South Vietnam, we have been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. Since then, our Montagnard's political and religious leaders have been tortured and imprisoned. Our population has been forced for relocations, and thousands have been condemned to live on some of the country's poorest cropland. Also, our ancestral lands are being deforested for logging and being used as rubber plantations. My statement today will focus primarily on religious persecution and human rights violations that confront the Montagnard, the Hmong, and other persecuted indigenous peoples of Vietnam. In 2011 and 2012, Human Rights Watch has published detailed reports on the continuing religious persecution of Montagnards in the Central Highlands and the extreme persecution of the Hmong Christians in the Northern Highlands. During 2011, entire Hmong villages have been destroyed by the Vietnamese government. Also, in May of 2011, Hmong Protestants gathered peacefully to ask for an end to religious persecution and the confiscation of their homes and lands. The Vietnamese government responded with violence, and the attacks resulted in multiple deaths and countless injuries. Also, August 21st, 2012, there had been reports that Montagnard Catholics were in the midst of prayer when they were raided by the Vietnamese police. In November 2012, Vietnam police carried out a sweeping operation of about 1,000 soldiers searching for Montagnard Catholics. They found 6 people. These men were severely beaten. One man was tied to a cross, while the others had their hands and feet tied and were surrounding him. The police then rounded up the villagers and threatened them with the same punishment if they continued out to carry out their religious beliefs. I also have some pictures that I want to include in the record. This is of a Hmong deacon who was tortured to death at the police station on March 17th, 2013. This is a Hmong Christian. He participated in the May 2011 protest that I had stated earlier. He escaped the police crackdown, but he was later found out, and when he tried to escape, he was shot down by the police. The religious persecution I just highlighted above also relates to numerous arrests regarding religious leaders. The Vietnam government is directly responsible for the cruel and terrible treatment of Montagnard Christians and other political prisoners. The Vietnam government continues to arrest, torture, and jail Montagnard Christians. There are currently over 400 Montagnard Christians in prison for their religious beliefs, some of them up to 16 years. Between 2001 and 2004, over 400 Montagnard house churches were taken over by the Vietnamese government. Hundreds of Montagnards were arrested and imprisoned for their participation in demonstrations which related to the policy of land confiscation and religious rights. To this day, many of these house churches still remain closed, and practically all these Montagnard prisoners are still in prison. They're also often forced to renounce their faith. They are beaten and many put in prison for many years without adequate water, food, medicine, and family visits. Many suffer solitary confinement and torture. These conditions have not improved. Two main areas that continue to experience problems are Pleiku and Buon Ma Thuot. Many of the issues I just described also leads to the Montagnards seeking asylum in Cambodia or Thailand. This in itself is another problem. Montagnard asylum seekers have no place to find sanctuary. There are hundreds of Montagnards who are hiding, and they are trying to flee persecution. They are hunted down by the police. They are beaten and put in jail. There are no safe haven for them when they escape to Thailand. They are also facing rejection by the UNHCR, and they are later arrested and put in immigration detention. The Hmong who flee to Thailand, most of them because of the May 2011 protests, are also experiencing similar problems. Right now, there are approximately 300 known cases which have been reported to the Hmong National Development Organization. Dozens of applications for refugee status have been filed with the UNHCR, and to date, every single application has been denied. There's another recent case that I want to highlight. Again, at this very moment, there are 2 Montagnard individuals who are hiding in the Central Highlands. They were participating in a protest, and because of that, they experienced persecution and physical beatings by the Vietnam police. For the last year, they have struggled to obtain an interview with the U.S. consulate. Finally, after a year of waiting, they went through 3 separate interviews. The whole time still continued to stay in hiding. And just recently, within the last week, they were told by the International Organization for Immigration that they now need a passport from the Vietnam government or their refugee application would be abandoned. And of course, with the fear of persecution, this would be a problem. Everything I've just stated is only a very brief general overview of the types of religious persecution and human rights violations that Montagnards and other indigenous people face. We do have some requests. In the latest USCIRF annual report for 2012, the Commission again recommended that Vietnam be returned to the list of countries of particular concern. We agree with this recommendation, and we urge the U.S. Congress and the U.S. government that the release of all Montagnard prisoners be negotiated for and their release obtained before any more U.S. government defense and trade treaties with Vietnam go forward. Also, in light of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which the U.S. administration and President Obama recently endorsed on December 2010, we also recommend that the U.S. government continue its dialogue with Vietnam to recognize the Montagnards, Khmer Krom, and Cham as its indigenous people. Vietnam has shown support of the United Nations Declaration, and we urge the U.S. Congress to put pressure on Vietnam to implement the principles of this declaration, especially since religious persecution is being experienced by all the indigenous groups. Also, we hope that the U.S. State Department will consider reopening its refugee program within Vietnam by acknowledging that there continues to be claims of well-founded persecution there. Again, Mr. Chairman, it's been my privilege to come here today, and I hope the U.S. government takes what I have said in consideration during future dialogue with Vietnam. Thank you.
Ms. Boignet, thank you very much for your testimony, your very specific recommendations as well, and we will follow up on each and every one of them. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to now ask Ms. Zan if she would testify.
Xin chào quý vị. Tôi là,
Distinguished members of the committee.
tôi là Danh Huy. Tôi sống và làm việc tại Houston, Texas.
My name is Danh Huy. I live and work in Houston, Texas.
Cảm ơn quý vị đã cho tôi cơ hội được đến đây để nói chuyện trong buổi điều trần hôm nay.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here to speak at this hearing.
Tôi đến đây với mục đích kêu gọi chính phủ Mỹ cứu giúp cho 15 em đang là nạn nhân nô lệ tình dục ở Nga. Em gái tôi là Huỳnh Thị Bé Hương, cũng là một trong số 15 em nạn nhân.
The purpose of my being here today is to call on the U.S. government to help with the rescue of 15 victims, Vietnamese victims who have been sex trafficked to Russia. My own little sister, Huỳnh Thị Bé Hương, is one among those 15.
Hương đã được thả về Việt Nam đầu tiên. Kế tiếp là 6 em lần lượt được thả về. Còn lại 8 em nạn nhân vẫn chưa được thả về.
My sister Hương was the first one to be released and returned to Vietnam. Then gradually 6 other victims were also released and allowed to return to Vietnam. However, there's still 8 victims being held captive in Russia.
Tôi hy vọng sau buổi điều trần này, quý vị sẽ lên tiếng giải cứu cho 8 em nạn nhân đang bị giam giữ ở Nga sớm được trở về sum họp với gia đình và bắt bà chủ nhà chứa ra chịu tội trước pháp luật không để bà ta hoành hành hại người nữa.
I truly hope that after this hearing, the committee, the Congress, and the government will help raise the voice so that the remaining 8 victims will be eventually rescued and allowed to go home and be reunited with their families in Vietnam. And also to ensure that the trafficker, the brothel owner, would be prosecuted before the law so that she won't be able to harm other victims anymore.
Cách đây hơn 1 năm, em Hương được hứa hẹn một công ăn việc làm, nhà hàng ở Nga. Nhưng ngay khi đến Nga, Hương bị tịch thu hết giấy tờ và bị đưa vào động mại dâm. Do một phụ nữ Việt Nam làm chủ, Hương bị bắt tiếp khách ngay ngày hôm ấy.
Over a year ago, my sister Hương was promised employment in a restaurant in Russia. However, as soon as she landed in Russia, her passport was confiscated and she was taken into a brothel owned and run by a Vietnamese woman. She was forced to serve sex clients immediately on that day.
Hương và các em nạn nhân thường xuyên bị đánh đập và không cho liên lạc về với gia đình.
My sister Hương and the other victims they were beaten regularly and they were not allowed to communicate with the family in Vietnam.
Tháng 7 năm ngoái, bà chủ nhà chứa gọi cho tôi. Bà đòi tiền chuộc là $2.000 thì mới thả em tôi về. Nhà quá nghèo, tôi phải đi vay mượn tiền đóng cho bà. Bà ta tăng lên thành 4.000 rồi lên $6.000. Tôi biết rằng bà ta không có ý định thả em tôi mà chỉ muốn moi tiền gia đình tôi.
Last July, the owner of the brothel, the trafficker, called me, demanding $2,000 as ransom as condition for the release of my little sister. Being so poor, I had to borrow the money to pay her. However, she raised the ransom to $4,000 and then to $6,000. I realized immediately that she never had the intention to release my sister, but only wanted to extort my family of our little resources.
Ngày 2 tháng 2 vừa rồi, em Hương và 3 nạn nhân đã chạy thoát được. Họ gọi về cho gia đình và gọi cho tòa đại sứ Việt Nam ở Nga cầu cứu. Chỉ ít lâu sau, 4 em đã bị bọn buôn người bắt lại và bị đánh đập, tra tấn mỗi ngày.
On February 2nd of this year, my sister Hương and 3 other victims managed to escape. They called home, and also they called the Vietnamese embassy in Russia to ask for help. Very soon afterwards, all 4 of them were recaptured by the traffickers, and they were beaten and tortured every day.
Nhưng sau đó, nhờ PSOS vận động báo chí Hoa Kỳ làm lớn chuyện, lại cùng với sự lên tiếng của ông dân biểu O'Brien và Bộ Ngoại giao Hoa Kỳ, em Hương và 6 em nạn nhân được thả về Việt Nam.
Then BPSOS, both people SOS, helped us and mobilized the involvement of the media, the U.S. media. And also there was Congressman Al Green who spoke out. And also thanks to the State Department, my sister Hương and 6 other victims, fellow victims, were released and were allowed to return to Vietnam.
Về đến nhà, Hương mới cho biết là bà chủ nhà chứa có quan hệ mật thiết với nhiều nhân viên trong tòa đại sứ Việt Nam ở Nga.
Once home, Hương then informed us that the brothel's owner had very close relationship with people at the Vietnamese embassy.
Bạn trai của bà ta có người anh ruột làm trong tòa đại sứ. Người anh ruột này lại lấy cháu gái của một giới chức có quyền lực trong tòa đại sứ.
her boyfriend, that is the owner's boyfriend's older brother, worked at the embassy, the Vietnamese embassy in Russia. And then that older brother is married to the niece of a very high-ranking official at the Vietnamese embassy as well.
Hiện nay, Hương đang trong tình trạng rất nguy hiểm, không dám về quê nhà tìm việc làm mà phải lẩn trốn ở tại Sài Gòn. Bởi vì bà chủ nhà chứa hăm dọa sẽ cho người tìm và hại các em, không để các em sống yên thân. Hương là người bà ta ra lệnh cho bọn tay chân tìm và hại cho bằng được không tha.
Currently, my sister Hương is in very dangerous situation. She doesn't dare to go home to her hometown to work, but she has to stay in hiding in Saigon because the trafficker had already threatened to send her subordinates to Vietnam to harm her and the other victims. They would not allow them to stay in peace in Vietnam. Hương is the very one that the trafficker had pointed out to her subordinates to track down and harm by all means and cost.
Hiện nay, Hương và các em đã hồi hương, đang cần sự giúp đỡ và bảo vệ. Và 8 em nạn nhân còn ở Nga, đang cần được giải cứu. Tôi xin gửi ủy ban này danh sách các nạn nhân và cùng hình ảnh của họ. Đây là Quỳnh Thị Bé Hương, là em gái của tôi.
Hương, right now, and the other victims who have returned to Vietnam really need help and also protection. And also, there are 8 others who are still in Russia. They need to be rescued. I would like to present to the committee and submit to the committee the list of the victims here, the list of victims, and also the pictures of some of the victims. And here's my little sister Hương.
Xin hãy nghĩ đến họ cũng như chính là con gái của quý vị.
Please think of them as your own daughters.
Tôi thay mặt các em gửi lời cảm ơn đến quý vị và cùng với ông dân biểu Aurin và tổ chức PSOS nhận đây lời cảm ơn chân thành và sự biết ơn của chị em chúng tôi. Cảm ơn rất nhiều.
On behalf of all these victims, I would like to thank you, distinguished members of the committee, especially Congressman Al Green and the Both People SOS organization. Please accept my deep gratitude.
Thank you.
Thank you for that extraordinarily moving story and the call to action on the part of our committee to do more on behalf of your sister who is in hiding, but all the other 8 who remain victimized in Russia. So thank you so much. I'd like to now call on Mr. Tran.
Kính thưa quý vị dân biểu Quốc hội, kính thưa toàn thể quý vị, tôi tên là Trần Thanh Tiến, một giáo dân từ Cần Giào, Đà Nẵng, Việt Nam.
Distinguished members of the committee, my name is Trần Thanh Tiến, a parishioner of Con Dầu village in Da Nang, Vietnam.
Tôi xin chân thành cảm ơn Chính phủ Hoa Kỳ và nhiều vị dân biểu, nghị sĩ cùng các nhân viên Quốc hội đã có mặt tại buổi điều trần hôm nay. Chính sự lên tiếng của quý vị đã đem lại sự tự do cho tôi.
I deeply thank the U.S. government, the members of Congress, and the congressional staffers who are here today. The fact that you had raised your voice brought me to freedom.
Tôi thấy có trách nhiệm trình bày với Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ về những hành vi phạm nhân quyền tại giáo xứ Cần Giào mà chính tôi là nạn nhân.
I feel that it is my duty, my responsibility to be here to present to the U.S. Congress about the violations of human rights in my parish, Con Dầu, where I was a victim myself.
Từ tháng 6 năm 2008, chính quyền Đà Nẵng đã đưa ra quyết định giải tỏa trắng toàn bộ giáo xứ Cồn Dầu, di dời tất cả 2.000 giáo dân và hơn 1.600 ngôi mộ tại nghĩa trang giáo xứ để xây dựng một khu du lịch sinh thái.
Since June of 2008, the city of Da Nang's government had already ordered the total wipeout of my parish, Con Dầu, the relocation of all 2,000 parishioners, and also the displacement of 1,600 graves at the cemetery of our parish, so that they could build and develop an ecotourism project.
Quyết định này vi phạm chính luật thu hồi đất đai của Việt Nam. Mục đích của việc thu hồi đất đai là để cho một công ty tư nhân đầu tư kiếm lời, chứ không phải là vì một lợi ích khác. Ngày 4 tháng 5, 2010, chính quyền Đà Nẵng đã đưa hàng trăm công an vũ trang đến ngăn chặn và đàn áp đám tang của một giáo dân.
This order violated Vietnam's own law on land. The reason for that, the purpose for the order to confiscate the land of our parish was to serve the interests of a privately owned development company and not for any public interest. On 4th of May 2010, the government of Da Nang City sent in hundreds of troops, police, to stop the funerals procession and broke up the procession of the burial of one of the parishioners.
Hàng trăm giáo dân, kể cả người già, đàn bà và trẻ em, bị đánh đập rất là tàn nhẫn. 62 người giáo dân bị bắt về đồn công an, bị tra tấn hàng tuần lễ, và trong số đó có tôi. 7 giáo dân bị kết án tù.
Over 100 parishioners, including the elderly, the seniors, the women, children, were brutally beaten by the police. 62 of us were taken to the police station where we were tortured for over a week, including myself. 7 of us the parishioners were sentenced to prison terms.
Giáo dân Nguyễn Thành Nam bị tra tấn, đánh đập cho đến chết.
Parishioner Nguyễn Thành Nam over there, the picture was over there, was tortured until death.
Tại đồn công an quận Cẩm Lệ, tôi bị liên tục gọi lên thẩm vấn. Người công an đọc những tội danh bắt tôi phải nhận. Nếu không nói đúng ý của họ thì hai công an đứng hai bên liền phăng lên đầu và khắp người của tôi. Nào là ghế, ba tôn, cây gỗ hay bất cứ vật gì có ở đó họ đều lấy, họ tra tấn tôi.
At the police station in Cẩm Lệ, I was calling in for interrogation repeatedly, continually. There was one police officer who read out all the crimes I had to admit to have committed. If I didn't say what they wanted me to say, immediately 2 police officers standing by my side beat me up using whatever they got hold of, such as the chair, the baton, wooden sticks.
Mặt mũi tôi thì máu me tuôn xối xả, tôi ngã quỵ xuống đất và họ dựng tôi lên đánh tiếp cho đến khi tôi ngất xỉu. Họ xối nước cho tôi tỉnh lại và thẩm vấn tiếp.
My face was all bloody. I fell down to the ground. They lifted me up and continued to beat me until I passed out. Then they poured water over my face and then continued the interrogation.
Sau 7 ngày tra tấn như vậy, thì họ thả tôi về với điều kiện là báo cáo các giáo dân khác và phải lên trình diện 3 ngày một lần tại đồn công an. Tôi đi khám bác sĩ, điều trị vết thương của tôi thì họ đều từ chối, biết tôi là người Cồn Dầu nên họ từ chối hết.
After 7 days of torture, I was released on the condition that I must report to the police the other parishioners who were involved in the funeral. And I had to report to the police station every 3 days. When I went to see a doctor for medical examination, about my injuries suffered during detention. All these doctors refused to treat me when they found out I came from Con Dao.
Hơn 90 giáo dân phải vượt biên giới sang Thái Lan xin tị nạn. Tôi là một trong số 34 người đầu tiên định cư đến Hoa Kỳ trong thời gian qua.
More than 90 parishioners had to leave Vietnam and seek protection, refugee protection in Thailand. I am one of the 34 who have arrived in the U.S. Since as a refugee.
Vài tuần sau khi đến Hoa Kỳ, tôi đi khám bệnh, thì bác sĩ chuyên khoa cho biết tôi bị lủng 2 màng nhĩ và con mắt trái của tôi bị thủng một lỗ do bị đánh đập va chạm mạnh quá. Và đây là cái hồ sơ bệnh lý của chuyên khoa đưa cho tôi.
A few weeks after my arrival in the U.S., I had a medical exam, and the doctor told me that my eardrums had been punctured, and also I had a hole in my eye caused by the very severe impact during the torture session. And here's the medical record.
Ngay lúc này, hơn 100 gia đình giáo dân còn bám trụ ở giáo xứ đang lo lắng vì một lệnh cưỡng chế mới. Cách đây 2 ngày, một gia đình bị lực lượng cưỡng chế sang bèn và đuổi ra. Họ dựng lều qua ngày hôm qua, đây thì là bị dẹp bỏ và đem đi chỗ khác, không cho ở.
Right now, over 100 families still left in Con Dao Parish. They are digging in, but they are very worried because there's a new order for them to vacate the parish. 2 days ago, a family was the police approached a family and then destroyed their homes using bulldozers. And just last night, the tent that they set up on their land just to stay overnight was taken away and they were transported away, I don't know where.
Việc tịch thu tài sản này còn xâm phạm nhiều công dân Hoa Kỳ gốc Con Dao. Họ vẫn còn nguyên chủ quyền tài sản hoặc qua thừa kế. Họ cũng đang có mặt tại buổi điều trần hôm nay.
This policy of confiscating properties in Con Dao actually violates the interests of many U.S. citizens who used to be Con Dao residents, parishioners. They still hold title to their properties in Con Dao, or they inherited the property from their deceased parents. And some of them are here today at this hearing.
Tôi tha thiết xin quý vị lên tiếng yêu cầu chính quyền Việt Nam chấm dứt ngay mưu toan xóa sổ giáo xứ của chúng tôi, chấm dứt việc tra tấn, đánh đập, bạo hành của công an, và nhất là chấm dứt việc tịch thu tài sản của công dân Hoa Kỳ.
I eagerly appeal to you, members of U.S. Congress, to request that the Vietnamese government immediately stop their intention to eliminate our parish in Con Dao, to immediately stop the brutality, the torture, and the violence committed by the police, and also to immediately stop the confiscation of the property of U.S. citizens.
Một lần nữa, xin chân thành cảm ơn quý vị để cho tôi có cơ hội lên tiếng cho đồng bào của tôi với tư cách là một con người trong đất nước tự do. Thank you. God bless America.
Once more, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of my fellow parishioners as a free man in a free country. Thank you, and God bless America.
Mr. Tron, thank you for bearing witness to a very ugly truth that you suffered yourself, but also on behalf of those who remain in Vietnam who are suffering to this day. And your testimony and the other testimonies, again, underscores what Congressman Gao said so eloquently, that Vietnam is the worst violator of human rights in Southeast Asia. And that fact has to emerge right now, especially during that dialogue, and our U.S. relationship vis-a-vis Vietnam must be predicated on a full understanding of that fact. Mr. Sifton.
Thank you. First, let me thank the committee as the other witnesses have, for inviting me to testify. The committee is definitely to be commended for its efforts, repeated efforts, to draw the world's attention to Vietnam's rights record. Unfortunately, I must confirm many of the reports today that that record has not improved. Since this subcommittee had a hearing on Vietnam last year, the rights situation has in fact worsened. The numbers are clear, and numbers can't lie, so there's really no doubt about it. The simple fact is that a growing number of dissidents, including religious leaders and bloggers and politically active people, are being convicted and sent to jail for violations of Vietnam's authoritarian penal code, which prohibits any kind of public criticism of the government or the Communist Party. By our count, which I believe Representative Royce cited earlier, which is a conservative count based on available information, it may be an undercount, shows that the trend lines are very, very clear. At least 40 people were convicted in political trials last year. That was an increase from 2011, which was an increase from 2010. And then again, just in the first 6 weeks of this year, another 40 people were convicted. The entire total for 2012 was matched in the first 6 weeks of 2013. These trials have themselves led to other arrests which have not yet led to new convictions, but probably will. During protests at some of the hearings, some of these trials, other activists are detained for protesting. And some of those arrested have been reporting beatings and even sexual assault. One blogger wrote a terrible account of being detained temporarily after a well-known trial in late 2012. She was beaten. She was forced to undergo a cavity search in front of other police officers, a sheer humiliation of the grossest form. There's also been an official campaign in recent months to suppress critical comments about a process currently underway to amend Vietnam's constitution. And this appears to have been a factor in the arrest on December 27th of last year of the lawyer Lê Quoc Quan, and in the harassment this year of several other critics. I should mention that Senators McCain and Kelly Ayotte and Sheldon Whitehouse and Joseph Lieberman met with Lê Quoc Quan in 2010, and I hope that they will write to the Prime Minister to raise their concerns now, and I think they will very soon. Thuggish harassment also seems to be on the rise, sort of street violence by unidentified thugs who are probably government agents. As Mr. I noted, just this week, Monday night, I believe, some men threw a bucket of rotten rice water and fish heads and fish intestines, a disgusting foul mix, into through the window of the writer Ngoc Ton, who I should note is the 2012 recipient of Human Rights Watch's Hellman Hammett Grant for writers who have been victims of political persecution. And later in the week, this week, April 8th and April 9th, mere days ago, the bloggers Bhuti Minh Han and Yen Chuk Duk were attacked by thugs on the streets of Hanoi. There were police nearby. They didn't do anything to intervene. And it affirms the common sense hypothesis that these unknown attackers, these thugs, are in reality just government actors, either paid goons or, in fact, police who are out of uniform. A picture of Nguyen Chuk Duk has been circulating widely on Vietnamese language sites in the last 24 hours, and they show, the bruises on his face from the beating. It looks to have been taken within minutes of the beating, for there's dried blood on his cheek. And I suspect, I'm not medically trained, but I suspect it was taken minutes after his attack because there isn't even any swelling. He probably looks worse today than he did when that photograph was taken. While the trend lines show this worsening situation, it should be noted that none of this is really new. I mean, Vietnam has unjustly imprisoned political prisoners for decades, and several of its current political prisoners have been in detention for decades. And in some instances, these prisoners have been denied proper medical care for their deteriorating health conditions. So one suggestion we've made to the Vietnamese government is that even if they disagree with the human rights groups, even if they disagree with the U.S. government about reversing their crackdowns and repealing their draconian laws, they at least agree that the very elderly and the very sick prisoners need not suffer in detention, and that whatever the merits of their supposed crimes, they don't pose a threat to the government, the party, or the people of Vietnam, and so they should be released. And that's a message I think everybody, including the State Department and the dialogue, will take as a kind of confidence-building measure. At least that could be done. There are, of course, many other human rights issues to discuss with respect to Vietnam: religious freedom, which has already been discussed, administrative detention and forced labor for drug users and alleged drug users and alleged sex workers. There's a lot of internet blocking and filtering going on, several dozen websites being blocked on Vietnam's ISPs, including Radio Free Asia and Voice of America, Vietnamese service. Each of these issues is discussed in our World Report 2013 chapter, which I've included with my testimony, written version. I'll also submit a recent statement from Human Rights Watch that we made 24 hours ago on the occasion of the the U.S.-Vietnam Human Rights Dialogue. As that statement makes clear, the focus really needs now to be on the Vietnamese government. I think this is something that we and everyone in the U.S. government agrees, both the State Department and the White House on this subcommittee. The spotlight really belongs on Vietnam itself, to give some kind of sign that it will address these issues and not ignore them. And in this context, it's important that everyone stand together, everyone in the U.S. government, and explain to them that the relationship, which has improved as just a basic matter of fact over the last few years, will not continue to improve unless Vietnam's government undertakes serious reforms to address the human rights problems we've spoken about today. A few of the issues that, a few of the avenues that the U.S. government can use are not just this dialogue, but the regular legislation that moves through this House and through the Senate on appropriations. I believe that in addition to the legislation that is underway for Vietnam in particular, the appropriations bill itself can do its part and send a message. Restrictions on the IMET military-to-military assistance, FMF, which is very small, but it does exist, could be strengthened. Language could be included to instruct the Secretary of the Treasury to use his voice and power on international financial institutions, such as the Asian Development Bank, to start being tougher on asking questions of Vietnam about what they're doing. I think if Japan and the United States together were to start asking questions on those international financial institutions, and also just in general, that would make a big difference. And then lastly, at the Human Rights Council. This year, Vietnam will go before Geneva for its universal periodic review, along with Cambodia. Just a coincidence, but Cambodia is up as well. It's very important that the State Department really not only criticize Vietnam in that forum, but marshal the diplomatic power to convince other countries to do so, especially countries like Japan and Australia. And that goes for Cambodia as well, although that's not the subject of this hearing today. There are other issues, levers that can be discussed, the trade agreements, the U.S. trade representative and his role, and the Pentagon, but we can discuss that in the questions if you'd wish. I'd be happy to take questions from the committee on these issues. Thank you.
For your testimony and for very concrete recommendations to the committee, to the White House, to state, and to Congress at large as to how we should proceed. I do hope your organization and you will look at our Vietnam Human Rights Act again, because we do have a very strong provision dealing with using our voice and vote at the Human Rights Council. And I think your point about marshaling other countries to join us, as again, Congressman Gao pointed out so well, this is the worst violator of human rights, and maybe there are others that are equal to, but in Southeast Asia. And again, the Human Rights Council has not distinguished itself as to membership. There are rogue nations that sit in good standing on it, and I think that brings nothing but dishonor to the process. And we need the Human Rights Council to be as faithful to promoting human rights, and who sits on it makes all the difference in the world. So, excellent point by you. Let me just ask, if I could, Ms. Zahn, if I could first begin with you. With regards to your sister, who is in hiding in Saigon, you mentioned, next week, I'll begin the process this week, but I'll ask to meet with the ambassador of Vietnam to specifically raise the issues raised by this panel, but to ask that your sister be protected, that the trafficker, as you pointed out, is in pursuit of her. She is in hiding, and a country that is a Tier 2 country, which Vietnam is, and that means that our government has suggested that they have taken action to meet the minimum standards prescribed in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It would be unconscionable for the government, once apprised of this situation, especially officially, to then look away and look askance and allow your sister to be further victimized. And I would say, you mentioned that the Russians on March 5th mounted a raid to rescue the victims, 14 of them at the time. However, 2 hours before the raid, a phone call from the Vietnamese embassy in Moscow tipped off Madame Thuan. She immediately moved the victims to another location. The Russian police only found an empty apartment. I recently we met, several of us, with the Russian ambassador to talk about adoptions and human trafficking. I will convey to him our gratitude that the Russian police did mount such an effort to liberate these Vietnamese women, and to ask that additional actions be taken to provide protection for them.
Will the gentleman yield?
Video.
You know, I would first of all like to join you in that meeting.
Oh, good.
But also, I believe that Ms. Dang mentioned that there were 8 other women, and I think that we should pursue them as well.
Yes. Exactly. And that is what we'll do with the Russians as well as with the Vietnamese ambassador. Why is it that it's okay for a government to allow its women to be raped, exploited, and abused in a country? Where is the national interest that Vietnamese young women are being so cruelly exploited? They ought to be leaving no stone unturned to protect. But when, as you said, there are people from the embassy itself exploiting these women, that probably tells the story. So we will follow up on that with the ambassador, and I hope he sees clear to meet with myself and Ms. Bass and Mr. Meadows and others who might want to join us for that meeting. Let me ask you just a few other questions. If you want to respond, please do. But Mr. Tron, I should say, thank you again for your testimony and for reminding us of the ongoing cruelty that has been committed against the parishioners, and you yourself having suffered. So if you and perhaps others could speak to the UNHCR. You know, I have raised with High Commissioner Gutierrez on several occasions the unavailability of UNHCR personnel to assist Montagnard and others who seek protection and are given obstacles that are just insurmountable. Where's your passport? You know, they have a well-founded fear of persecution. They are being persecuted, and yet they are left adrift. I'm a great fan of the UNHCR. I think I've been to refugee camps all over the world. You know, they're good people, but they have not stepped up to the plate, in my opinion, to meet their obligations here. So if you could maybe speak to the UNHCR problem. And again, we will ask, this committee will ask that High Commissioner for Refugees Gutierrez appear before the committee. We have jurisdiction over the UN in this committee as well. And as we've done in the past, He will come in an official briefing because UN personnel are not allowed to testify in an official hearing. But frankly, it is a distinction without a difference. He will sit here and we will ask very courteous but very real questions of him. So if you could elaborate, if you will, on the UNHCR problems that you have encountered. Ms. Wood.
I'm not exactly sure why all these cases have been denied. I just have heard from other people, for example, that some of the officers are cutting people off during questioning. I know with the Montagnard situation, it may be a translation problem also. A lot of Montagnards don't speak fluent Vietnamese, which that could also be an issue. I've also heard from someone who works with Hmong National Development, for example, these victims will have scars on their bodies and they won't even get a chance to show the evidence of the torture, of the beatings, of their persecution. And also with the problem of the passports, this is after people have been in hiding for, for this recent case. I mean, it's been over a year. And then to finally go through the whole process, the whole time being in hiding, and then at the end of the line, they're saying, we need a passport, which they don't have, and then which they have to go get from the Vietnamese police. I mean, how do you ask people who are already in fear to then go get a passport from the Vietnamese police? So I'm not exactly sure what the right solution would be, but I just know right now the mechanisms in place are not working.
Yes, if I may, we have lawyers in Bangkok right now. We have legal teams in Bangkok to help about 900 Vietnamese asylum seekers. And there are some systemic issues. One is that the UNHCR doesn't allow any legal representation. So these asylum seekers go into the interview and they don't know how to articulate their claims. And they're not allowed to have anyone to come with them. And second, it looks like there's a policy of not allowing Montagnard and Hmong to be even registered for an interview with the UNHCR. So they don't want to see more Montagnard as an implicit policy. They don't see any more Hmong. And I would like to bring to your attention that at least right now there are 4 cases, 3 Montagnard and 1 Khmer Krom, who have been denied refugee status by the UNHCR. They have been told that they could return to Vietnam in safety, and they did return to Vietnam, and they were captured and tortured and imprisoned. And the UNHCR tried to go to Vietnam to visit them, but they were denied access. And 4 of them made it out of Vietnam, and they are now in Thailand.
Okay. If you could, Dr. Tong, provide additional information for the record, that would be very
Yes, thank you.
You know, and just let me point out to my colleagues and to our witnesses, we've had hearings on North Korea, and I've also met with High Commissioner Gutierrez on North Korean women who were trafficked into China once they made it across the border thinking they had escaped to relative freedom, and then were trafficked and sexually abused. The Chinese government sends them back sometimes, and when they send them back, they go to prison, they are tortured, some of them are executed, and we heard from witnesses tell firsthand knowledge of that happening. It is a gross violation of refoulement, of sending someone back when you have basic information that they will be so hurt. And China has signed the Refugee Convention. They're in violation of it, and the UNHCR and others have failed to take action. So, you know, the importance of these agencies is to take action when it is profoundly inconvenient, because they are all about protection, and that's what we will at least admonish the High Commissioner to do with regards to these individuals. Let me ask you, finally, Mr. Tron, and then I'll go to some of the others after my colleagues. What has been the response of the U.S. Department of State, as well as the U.S. Trade Representative, to what has happened to your parish and the abuse that has been visited upon the parishioners, including yourself?
Dạ, tôi chưa nghe nói gì về cái sự can thiệp của Bộ Ngoại giao hay là chính phủ Mỹ về giáo xứ của chúng tôi.
No, I have not heard anything from the State Department or other agencies from the US government about intervention and help for the parish.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes.
Yes. Even when I was in the U.S. House, I brought up the issue directly with the Department of State and also through the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam. And I was received with somewhat of a lukewarm answer that they are looking into the problem, they are looking into the issue, but nothing was done. No utterances from the Department of State to condemn the actions of the Vietnamese government in the parish of Con Dao, along with the other locations as well as other religious groups that were being persecuted by the Vietnamese government. And this has traditionally been, I guess, the practice of the Department of State. To deal with these many issues with a blind eye, or simply to utter rhetoric without taking any action whatsoever. And in my own opinion, that if we continue to act in this way, then we are simply incomplicit with these despicable acts, because we are supporting a government to stay in power, a government that continues to persecute its people, a government that continues to torture religious leaders, a government that continues to make false arrests and to detain citizens without the due process of law. And again, I would urge you, Mr. Chairman, along with members of the subcommittee, to bring this very issue to the State Department, to ask them to take action, to ask them to sit down with us and other members of the community who are knowledgeable about the Vietnamese government, who are knowledgeable about the Vietnamese culture, to consult with us on how to dialogue with the Vietnamese government. That's all we ask.
Mr. Ai, if you could tell us, in your testimony, you mentioned Ordinance 44, which authorizes detention of dissidents in labor camps and psychiatric prison. Is Ordinance 44 being used today?
Vietnam used Ordinance 24 along with other colorful ordinances. And again, because they do not abide by the rule of law, it is difficult for us to even comprehend what basis they are using to arrest dissidents as well as individuals who speak out against the government. And then if we were to look at their actions in Con Dao along with other parishes, even though when I spoke with the Department of State, with the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam, again, at that time it was Ambassador Michael Mihalik who was in Hanoi, his response was, oh, these are just simply land disputes. They are simply land disputes between individuals. And again, this is just a simple excuse for them to overlook the question, to overlook the problem, and to proceed on with possibly economic conversations or what you have between Vietnam and the U.S. government. Vietnam's intention in taking land from religious institutions, in taking land from religious communities, their intention is to suppress religious freedom. That is their intention. Right. And these disputes are not simply property disputes between landowners or what have you.
Thank you. Mr. Ai, did you want to answer that, please?
Yes, I would like to talk something about the Ordinance 44. Many people forget that in Vietnam, they are not only the prison as such, but the Ordinance 44, all popular home, pagoda, church become a prison, like the case of Thích Quảng Độ. He is now in his own pagoda as a prison. And Ordinance 44 can arrest or send the people under house arrest for all the policemen in the town, in the countryside. They can do that. And they don't need with any due process law. And more than that, they can send people in the labor camp or psychiatric hospital. It's like under Soviet Union. It's horrible. And now there are 3 bloggers are arrested under the Ordinance 44 and sent to the psychiatric hospital psychiatric like Lê Anh Hùng, like Nguyễn Trung Lĩnh, or Bùi Minh Hằng, and so on. And especially the case of Thích Quảng Độ. Thích Quảng Độ do not be treated by before the process of law. And they hear that the policemen say that you are now under arrest, under house arrest. And since 10 years, he is now in Thanh Minh Thể Viện as a prisoner, as under house arrest. So I think that many times we ask in the council in Geneva, Human Rights Council, to abolish and the Ordinance 44, but until now they didn't do anything for the Ordinance 44. So I would like to ask you to press Vietnam in order to abolish the Ordinance 44.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
When I did meet with the Venerable Thích Quảng Độ in his pagoda, I'll never forget how impressed I was, and I know others who have met with him, with his incredible peace and a sense of strength and resolve. But he told me that if he walked out the door with me, it would be a matter of seconds that security apparatus personnel and secret police would swarm and push him back and hit him right back into the pagoda. That's how ubiquitous this secret police is. Ms. Bass.
Thank you. Once again, thank you all for your testimony today. And in particular, I want to express my gratitude to your willingness to share what I know are very painful stories, situations, and memories of abuse. I just have a couple of questions because I wasn't sure I understood what was the important thing to happen. For example, I know the U.S. is getting ready to have this dialogue. It seemed as though I heard 2 different opinions as to whether or not you feel the dialogues are useful and are important. I believe I heard it, and it might have been from Mr. I, that he said that he felt that the dialogues could be used as a shield. So I don't know if there is a difference of opinion. That's fine. I just wanted to understand what you thought about the dialogue with the U.S. Should they be stopped? Should they continue?
No, I think that we must have a dialogue. I agree. We have to dialogue in order to talk and to change. As I talked in my remark, the human rights dialogue is only relevant if it leads to concrete progress. But I saw since many years the dialogue, human rights dialogue between Vietnam and United States, between Vietnam and Australia, and between Vietnam and many countries in Europe, that don't conduct to any change on human rights in Vietnam. I think that Vietnam has a 2-track political, 1-track political for international. That means they show for every people that Vietnam respect human rights, respect democracy, and sometimes like the Secretary General of Communist Party, Lê Duẩn, say that the democracy in Vietnam is 1,000 more democracy in the Western country. The democracy of one party. It's 1,000 times more than, democracy in the Western country. And so for the international, they use the dialogue human rights as a shield to say that, yes, the fact that they dialogue with United States prove that they respect human rights. But can you tell us, through many years, through this dialogue between United States and Vietnam, what can change in Vietnam? Now everything is the same, and they try, and the two-track policy, as I say, the policy inside of Vietnam is to repress people, repress the religion, the blogger, the netizen, and so on. Many netizen, blogger, they try to aspire about the human rights, about the democracy, and even that they are accused for 20 years under prison, like the case of Điếu Cày, as we have heard last time. So I think that, of course, we need the human rights dialogue, but we hope that United States set a benchmark and a time frame for improvement, without that Vietnam does not stand on the human rights.
I also wanted to ask, in terms of the religious prosecution, is it of all religions, or is a particular religion singled out? The religion, perhaps, that Mr. Chairman Royce was talking about. Is religion just an excuse for political persecution?
Again, Ranking Member Bass, the Communist government of Vietnam persecutes all religion across the board, and more particularly, they target those groups of people that do not have a voice, the Montagnards, the other minority ethnic groups in Vietnam. But there has been some progress made on the issue of religious freedom in Vietnam recently, when many of the religious leaders demanding changes to the Vietnamese constitution, asking that power belong to the people, asking that land belong to the people and not to the government. And I want to, again, briefly address your previous question concerning dialogue. We've been having dialogue with Vietnam for the past 38 years. And in the last several years, our dialogue with Vietnam has not been followed up with action. And Vietnam recognize that. They recognize that when we approach them and talk to them about human rights, about religious freedom, they're simply empty words. Because why? Because no actions have been taken by the U.S. government to challenge Vietnam on their violations of human rights and religious freedom.
Okay, thank you.
And therefore, I would ask the Congress to take actions now to back up our dialogue with action, to show Vietnam that these are no longer empty words.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Ms. Don, and please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your names, but I think you were saying something about that the State Department was helpful at some point in the release of your sister, and if that is the case, if that was what you said, what did they do?
Dạ, nhờ sự lên tiếng của ông dân biểu O'Brien và Bộ Ngoại giao Hoa Kỳ đã truyền tin cho cảnh sát Nga.
That was thanks to the intervention of Congressman Al Green, who is a representative in Houston. And because of that, the U.S. State Department has passed information about the victims to the Russian police.
I see. So he did a phone call or a letter or something.
Ông Al Green, ông gọi cho Bộ Ngoại sao hay là gì, nếu mà không biết thì nói là không biết. Nhưng mà ông có hứa phải không?
Dạ.
And so was that when you said that the Russians were tipped off?
Có phải lúc đó là cảnh sát Nga là
I remember you described an incident where they were tipped off so that the woman that was in charge of the brothel was able to...
cảnh sát Nga định giải cứu xong rồi bà An mà đưa mọi người đi hết đấy.
Dạ vâng. Cảnh sát Nga đã đột nhập để giải cứu các em, nhưng mà bà Thúy An đã được bên tòa lãnh sự quán đã thông báo trước cho bà, cho nên là bà đã di dời chỗ ở và di dời các em đi nơi khác, cho nên là cảnh sát Nga đến giải cứu thì không gặp được nạn nhân nào hết, cho nên cái buổi giải cứu đó không thành công.
That's right. When just before the Russian police undertook the raid, the Vietnamese embassy, someone there called Miss Thuy An, that is the brothel's owner, to tip her off. And she moved all the victims immediately. And therefore, when the Russian police made the raid, there was no one left in that apartment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for your testimony today. Congressman Cao, thank you for coming in, and I have a couple of questions for you. Given you were talking about the backsliding of Vietnam and the government, and yet here they are trying to be recognized for by the international community for their improvements in human rights. Can you explain, I guess, the repression that we're seeing, but yet where they're going with this and trying to be recognized from an international standpoint?
Congressman, again, I do not understand the irony in all of this.
Okay.
I simply, at least this is a personal opinion of mine, I simply believe that their actions, at least the actions that they are taken, are simply steps for them to sidetrack the fact that their record say very clearly that they have been backsliding in the past several years since 2007. And again, the actions taken by the Vietnamese government is another explicit message that at least the words that are uttered by us and by other international communities, when they are not followed by actions, are simply empty words. And therefore, the actions that they have taken clearly shows that they do not take our words into much consideration whatsoever.
So your compelling message this today would be that if we're going to make a statement, we need to have teeth and action behind that statement, not just simply rhetoric that plays well in the media.
That is absolutely correct.
Okay.
Historically, at least in the past 4 or 5 years, we, at least the administration has spoken of Vietnam human rights violations, but at the same time, they are sitting down with Vietnam at the table, talking about the TPP, talking about GSP, talking about other economic and other benefits. You know, when we send a mixed message like that, it is extremely difficult, not only for us as a government, but for other organizations such as Boat People SOS, to make a push to Vietnam to make those changes that are required before they get the benefits of GSP, before they get the benefits of TPP.
Okay. And the chairman in this very room just a couple of days ago, we had a hearing that highlighted some of the human rights violations with regards to China, and part of that testimony talked about the fact that what we needed to do is not have a human rights dialogue that is separate than some of the other dialogue that is going on, whether it be military, whether it be economic, whether it be other trade, that it needs to be all-inclusive. Would you agree that that would be the most pragmatic approach and most meaningful approach with regards to Vietnam?
I absolutely agree, because when we look at the history of our country, this great nation was founded on the principles of religious freedom, on the principles of the freedom of expression and individual rights. And if we were to neglect those principles that make our country great in dealing with other countries, then we ourselves are acting in a hypocrisy. You know, we ourselves are acting in a way that encourages other countries to be involved in wrongdoings. So I absolutely agree with Chairman Smith that when we speak with Vietnam on the issues of on the issues of economic trade, on the issues of military exercises, that we must demand that they improve their human rights and religious freedom records.
And so, having been a member of Congress and having the power to vote, and knowing that TPP is coming up and that dialogue is real today, would it be your recommendation to other members of Congress, of a body that you have been a member of, to encourage them not to ratify that unless this human rights violation is not only addressed, but addressed in a real and meaningful way?
That is absolutely correct. I highly recommend that the U.S. Congress would not ratify Vietnam's entrance into TPP, would not ratify any actions taken by the administration to grant Vietnam GSP until some of these issues are concretely corrected by the Vietnamese government.
Okay, and let me follow up on that, because I believe in your testimony you encourage Congress to pass a Vietnam human rights legislation specifically with regards to Vietnam. Is the government of Vietnam sensitive to the actions that we would take here in Congress with respect to human rights, or is it, do they kind of just not pay attention?
Of course, the Vietnamese government, like other authoritarian regime, they recognize the acts of Congress. And over the past years, even though we have passed the Vietnam Human Rights Act through the House, but eventually it got stuck in the Senate, the passage of the Vietnam Human Rights Act through the House speaks very loudly of where we are as a government, that we are willing to challenge the Vietnamese government on their human rights records, on their religious freedom records. But I believe that this is the right time for us to take further steps to not only pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act and the Vietnam Sanctions Act through the House, but to make a concerted effort to get it through the Senate and get them signed by the President. And if you were to look at the explicit language of those two acts, the language allows the President, after he signs those acts into law, to provide the President with waivers when he deems fit. So it is not, these acts are not somehow bound the President in any way, but at least when necessary, it gives the President teeth to force Vietnam to make these changes. So again, I urge the U.S. Congress to present the Vietnam Human Rights Act, to present the Vietnam Sanctions Act, to pass it through the House, to pass it through the President, to pass it through the Senate, and to get the President sign these two acts into law.
And one last follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if with the tier ranking that has been changed by the State Department, obviously to show improved status with regards to human rights, do you think that sends conflicting messages in terms of where we are as a nation? And not to condemn the State Department, I know they're well-meaning folks, but does it send the wrong message?
Again, I absolutely agree with you that when we utter phrases, when we utter words challenging Vietnam and human rights, but at the same time move them out of the list of countries of particular concerns, again, we are sending Vietnam mixed messages that what we are saying are simply empty words.
Okay.
And they fully recognize that. And I, again, urge the U.S. government to put Vietnam back on the list of particular concerns, to make sure that Vietnam knows that our words are no longer empty words, and that we are now willing to take action to demand changes in Vietnam.
Okay. Ms. Zahn, thank you for your testimony. It touches my heart. My daughter, Haley, who is 19 years old, has brought the human trafficking dilemma, horrific actions across this nation to my attention 3 or 4 years ago. You today have brought it home when you said that these victims, look at them as your own daughters, and that's what we must do as a people. We must not look at it as some horrific tragedy and action that is taking place far, far away. We must look at it as if it were our own daughters. And so I thank you for sharing your story. I want to go on a little, but ask you specifically with regards to this action. Would you see, with the State Department changing this tier ranking and the complicity that we've seen with regards to the Vietnam government, do you think that that is creating an environment where the international community is saying we will turn the blind eye to these awful sex trafficking, human trafficking efforts?
Dạ vâng. Theo như tôi nghĩ thì Mỹ cần phải làm mạnh hơn để được giải cứu cho các em. Và không những các em mà 19 tuổi, có em chỉ mới 16 tuổi mà thôi. Em này 16 tuổi.
Yes, the U.S. government should put more pressure on the Vietnamese government so that they will truly protect the victims. And I would like to point out in these pictures here, they are not just teenagers, but there's one of them who's just 16. And this is a 16-year-old minor among the victims. And the other are all 19 to 20 or 21 years old.
And my last question, do you think your sister's story and the story of these 15 people is truly a unique story? Or would you say that there are many other Vietnamese women who are being victimized even now?
Vâng, không chỉ riêng một mình em Hương mà có rất nhiều trường hợp, rất nhiều em lâm vào cái hoàn cảnh như vậy.
Yeah, it's not just my sister, it's not just these 15, but there are a lot of other young Vietnamese women in the same situation in Russia.
Well, I thank each one of you for your testimony. I have to speak on the House floor in just a few minutes, and so my leaving is not an indication of anything other than a great desire to say thank you for being here today. And with that, I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much for your robust participation and your deep and abiding concern for human rights in Vietnam. If there's anything any of our distinguished witnesses would like to say before we close. Yes, Mr. Ai.
I would like to have the last word. So I hope so much that the Congress will adopt the Vietnam Human Rights Act, because I have the feeling that the United States support human rights only for 3 million Communist Party, but not for 87 million Vietnamese people. And I hope so much that you can work in order to redesignate Vietnam on the CPC. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Sifton.
I would just add that on the issue of this dialogue being useful or not, it might be important to add one word of elucidation. I think it wouldn't be correct to assume that the U.S. government doesn't raise human rights issues outside of this dialogue. I think they do, and I think Ambassador David Shear does do that quite a bit, and he encourages the U.S. trade representative to do it. I know the Pentagon does it in the context of the conversations they have. The question is, do they do it enough? And what should they do if Vietnam doesn't improve? And I think that's the big question that we still haven't settled. It's a very difficult question. The effort to convince and pressure and invade and dialogue with the government of Vietnam involves some really complex dynamics. So all I'd say is the only glimmer of hope, I think, is the party doesn't want to relinquish power, but nor does it want to lose power and be swept aside. And they are worried about wildcat strikes and land uprisings and their international standards and their economic situation, especially given last year. And so there are things they may want to do, but those are decisions they need to make, the government of Vietnam. They can be pressured, they can be convinced, they can be invaded, they can be tricked even, perhaps. But it's not just simply a matter of bashing them over the head. But I think there are some opportunities there. And then as last, on the Human Rights Council, it goes without saying that the State Department and the White House will oppose Vietnam as a member of HRC. What I really think might be useful would be for members of Congress to pressure the State Department, not just to do that, but to really rally the rest of the council. Yeah. Argentina, Brazil, India, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, all the other members who would sort of be on the fence to say, you guys got to stand up with us as well. That's a very important.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sifton. Mr. Tran.
Dạ, tôi xin bổ sung thêm một trường hợp gần đây ở giáo xứ Cồn Dầu có liên quan trực tiếp đến chính quyền và xã hội đen, là chính quyền công an ở Đà Nẵng đã kết hợp với lại xã hội đen để mà coi như đàn áp giáo xứ chúng tôi. Là một vụ việc gần đây là gia đình Trần Thị Hòa và Nguyễn Hữu Danh, là coi như chính quyền buộc họ là phải ký kết vào giấy tờ để mà di dời đi chỗ khác, nhưng mà họ quyết định không ký, muốn ở lại đó, thì công an mới bố rốt quanh làng không cho ai vào khu vực đó và đưa xã hội đen vào, đánh đến mức độ ngất xỉu.
Oh, I'd like to add one point relating to the relationship, the close relationship between the police and the thugs. Recently at Gonzo Parish, just last December, there was a case of a family of Trần Thị Hòa and Nguyễn Hữu Danh.
Yeah.
They refused to sign the paperwork to relocate, so they dug in. And then the police surrounded the village, blocked the village, letting no one leave, and they escorted the thugs in. And the police surrounded the house while the thugs broke into the house and beat up the couple, and the wife passed out. And that shows that there's a close relationship between the police and the thugs.
Và bây giờ họ rất là điêu đứng, mà phải chạy sang Thái Lan để mà xin tị nạn, nhưng mà chưa được cấp quy chế và cũng như là chưa được một cái sự can thiệp nào cả.
Out of fear, they just fled to Thailand to seek refugee protection, but they still are without status.
Và chính quyền Việt Nam còn ham dọa nếu mà bắt được họ thì sẽ thủ tiêu luôn.
Oh, and the Vietnamese authorities even threatens that if they got caught and recaptured, they would be eliminated.
Yes.
I do have one last thing to add. In your continued dialogue with Vietnam, I just wanted you to, I guess, remind the communist government that, yes, everything is similar in terms of religious persecution between the Vietnamese and the indigenous people, but I feel like when it comes to the Montagnards, the Hmong, the Khmer Krom, the Cham, it's even worse. And one reason is because of the allying with the US government during the Vietnam War, and also because they were already suppressed populations, and on top of being persecuted for their religion and because of their ethnicity, there's also lots of, I guess you say, problems with land confiscation, so now they're losing their homeland. And just to keep that in mind with your dialogue, that we are all here in unity, but at the same time, the indigenous people face a little bit different a situation than the majority of the Vietnamese do.
And just for clarification, the forced renunciations of faith,
Right.
they continue?
They do still continue, yes.
Are they widespread?
From what I've heard, they're widespread. Like I said, two regions that I mentioned earlier, Pleiku and Buemitut, were one of the major ones because there's constant police surveillance. So it's like the people, they're scared to do anything. You know, they're just being watched all the time.
Because one of the preconditions for removal from CPC some years back was the ambassador at large had what he thought were deliverables, as he described it, and one of them was to completely end the forced renunciations of faith. CPC was eliminated for Vietnam, and yet the forced renunciations and other repression against all other faiths
Still
continue as well.
continuing.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? I want to thank you for your testimony, your very, very timely and very comprehensive recommendations to the subcommittee, for your valiant efforts on behalf of human rights, and for those who have suffered personally. Thank you for your willingness to share that with us. It will mobilize and not just inform, but mobilize this committee to do even more. So thank you so very much. The hearing is adjourned.